Hello, I'm Mike Moore, and thank you for joining me in an exciting series that I've entitled Muted Voice. My singular goal in this series is to challenge the body of Christ to speak out against racism. Now, this title, Muted Voice, was birthed out of a prophetic word that the Holy Spirit spoke to me on June the 19th, 2020. I heard the Holy Spirit say these words: a muted voice is no voice. A muted voice is no voice. Now, in this sixth episode, I want to talk from the subject why white people struggle talking about racism. Why white people struggle talking about racism. Now, conversations on race and racism are difficult but necessary conversations. White Fragility is a book that I have spoken about. It was written by Robin DiAngelo, a white anti-racist educator and lecturer. I highly recommend it. I've read this book more than one time. But in her book, she both asks and answers the question, why is it hard for white people to talk about racism? She discusses in a clear, compassionate, and hopeful way the emotions and the defensive moves that white people make when challenged racially. The emotional responses such as anger, fear, guilt, and behavior such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal. She said in her first opening statements that she was mainly writing to a white audience and using her insider status to challenge racism. And what she meant by insider status is this is a white person talking to white people and challenging them about racism. On the other hand, I want to talk about this subject and discuss this subject from both an outsider's status and preferably a spiritual perspective. Now, before we begin our discussion today, I want to say that I am not talking about whether or not white people are racist or not. I personally don't believe that all white people are racist. Neither am I discussing the fact that every single white person struggles talking about racism. I personally know whites who are open, secure, and transparent in their discussions about race, and they're willing to connect. But in this episode, I want to talk about what I'm calling 3 roadblocks to open and transparent communication. I want to talk about blindness or blind spots. I want to talk about a lack of empathy. And then finally, I want to talk about denial. Let's talk about blindness because I believe that blindness or a blind spot is a roadblock to whites opening up freely and talking about racism. Matthew chapter 7, verse 5 in the traditional King James Version says, first, cast out the beam, the wood or log, out of thine own eye, then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote, the speck, or the dust out of thy brother's eye. So in this particular text, Jesus says that there's something in our own eye that keeps us from seeing clearly. Something in our own eye that keeps us from seeing clearly. Now, racism is very apparent to people of color. We see it very clearly. and other minorities see it very clearly. And others who may be victimized by racism see it very clearly. But it is a blind spot to many white people. And remember, I'm not talking to white people in general, I'm talking about Christians. I'm speaking to the church. So, what is a blind spot? What is a blind spot? A blind spot is a gap in a person's perception that blinds them from seeing the truth about themselves and others. A gap in a person's perception that blinds them from seeing the truth about themselves or others. A blind spot is a complete lack of insight about how one's behavior is affecting others. A complete lack of insight about how one's behavior is affecting others. In other words, the refusal to listen, it affects us in a negative way. Defensiveness, it shuts down the conversation. Anger and justification shuts down the conversation. Since everyone, I'm talking about everyone now, since everyone has blind spots, we all need someone to tell us the truth, even at the expense of hurting our feelings. I want to give you an example of a blind spot. Natalie Grant, a white award-winning singer, and I'm using the designation white because we're talking about racism. Natalie Grant, a white award-winning singer, and her husband, composer Bernie Herms, also white, revealed recently that they lost thousands of followers after speaking out against racism after the death of George Floyd. Thousands of followers they say they lost because they spoke out against racism. Now, I was reading a post, someone who posted their discontent with them speaking out against racism, and listen to the post and see whether or not you can see a blind spot. You should just shut up. Stick to what you are best at. Just keep writing and singing your songs. You're not helping. You're just another out of touch liberal celebrity creating more division. This is a blind spot. And I want to read the post again to you. See, can you catch the blind spot? You should just shut up. Stick to what you're best at. Just keep writing and singing your songs. You're not helping. You're just another out of touch liberal celebrity creating more division. Now, notice here, we have a white Christian couple speaking out against racism, and then we have this post from someone that I take it was white. And notice the disconnect, notice the blind spot. Keep writing your songs and singing your songs. What kind of songs? Christian songs. Just stay with singing and writing Christian songs. Just stay right there and do that, because you're not helping talking about racism. You're just a liberal celebrity, and you are creating more division. That's a blind spot, because this person, whoever this person was, did not see the connection between Natalie Grant's and her husband's Christianity, and speaking out against it, racism, speaking out against racism. So I consider that a blind spot. It's a gap in the person's perception. Not only is it a blind spot, but I consider this is what white Christianity looks like. Just recently, though, I realized that I had a blind spot in my own life. In a prior episode, in episode 2, I was talking about generational racism, and I wanted to use an illustration, and I brought up the illustration of my daughter. And at the age of maybe 4 or 5, now she's in her mid 30s now, but at the age of 4 and 5, she attended this Christian school, and her and her classmate, this little white girl, were playing a game. So when she came home, she was so excited about the game that they had played. So we asked what was the game. He said, Mom and Maid. So in the second episode, I said to my 4, 5-year-old daughter, you're never going to be a maid. Now, I didn't say this in the second episode, but I did say this to her as I recollected my thoughts. I said to you, if anybody's going to be the mama, you're going to be the mama. Well, one of my members, talking about blind spots, one of my members, a beautiful, godly, committed man of God, gave me some feedback. And I'll read just a portion of the feedback. Listen what he says. He said, awesome teaching today, because he texts me on an ongoing basis, so very encouraging. He said, awesome teaching today. However, may be maids in your audience, and I'm not sure they felt good about your comments Sunday. Work is honorable, and Scripture says no matter what kind of occupation you have. Now, he said much more than that. But he was talking about the fact that I was making a comment about one thing. He didn't say this, but this is what I heard, but I was being insensitive in another area. Now, once I got the feedback, I saw it. It was crystal clear to me. I was talking about racial, ethnic socialization, but I was using an example of a social or class or a domestic worker. And in the illustration, the domestic worker was speaking in a somewhat degrading way. Now, I didn't intend to insult anybody, but I saw that how you can sometimes be insensitive and not even know it. Sometimes you can mean well, because the point that I was making, I think most people got it. But at the same time, I was being insensitive and, in fact, acting in a prejudiced way against domestic workers. So I just want to stop right here and say, listen, I personally received the feedback. I asked any person who listened to episode 2 and it somehow made you feel degrading, any domestic worker that was not my intent. However, I agree with the feedback that it was insensitive, and I just want to ask your forgiveness. I wanted to do it in such a way where I would be authentic, because I sincerely saw it, and I sincerely ask your forgiveness about it. But at the same time, it also indicates how we can have blind spots, be sincere, don't intend to be insensitive, and at the same time be insensitive. And then I thought about it, and as I began to meditate, especially in this particular area, I thought about, okay, if whites or others have blind spots about racism, what is it going to take to remove those blind spots? I think it's going to take prayer. I think as Christians, we're going to have to always be asking God to search us, to evaluate us, to give us feedback, because we don't always see ourselves. So I'm constantly praying that God will show my motives, make clear my motives. And I think every white person needs to be evaluating, spending time with God, asking God to reveal themselves to them. And you know what? I think it's going to take more than just us praying. I think we're going to have feedback. We're going to have somebody, just like this member spoke to me from the outside. I think maybe that's why God is leading me to talk to you about why you struggle talking about racism, because maybe an outsider's view can help you. But you have to be willing to listen, and you have to be willing to act out on what you learn. So I believe that one reason why whites struggle talking about race, just talking about it, is I believe that it is a blind spot there. I believe that there's some blindness. The second area is a lack of empathy. A lack of empathy. Why white people struggle talking about racism? I believe a lack of empathy. Now, what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to relate to the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of others. The ability to relate to the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of others. And it's something about when people show that they understand, you end up coming close, you end up getting closer to that person. But when people are indifferent, it just continue to drive a wedge there. Now, there are three distinct kinds of empathy that I like for us to look at. Three distinct kinds of empathy: emotional empathy, cognitive empathy, and emphatic empathy, or emphatic concern. Emotional empathy is the ability to feel what someone else feels. The ability to feel what someone else feels. Now, cognitive empathy is the ability to understand another person's perspective. The ability to understand another person's perspective. And then third, emphatic concern is the ability to sense what another person needs from you. The ability to sense what another person needs from you. And you know, this is scriptural. This is really scriptural. Empathy is scriptural. Romans chapter 12, verse 15. Romans 12:15 in the New Living Translation. It says, when others are happy, be happy with them. If they are sad, share their sorrows. I want to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. I want to give you an example of what I believe is a lack of empathy, and then I want to give you an example of what empathy looks like on a racial level. Let's look at what empathy does not look like. It does not look like this. Let's say we are in a relay race. A relay race. And you know, a relay race has certain legs that one person runs, hand the baton to another runner, hands the baton till they cross the finish line. And let's say we're in the race of life. This is the race of life. And I've got the baton in my hand at the starting gate. The starting gate. And I represent the black race. And let's say you have the baton in your hand and you represent the white race. And the horn sounds, and we're running 100 yards. The horn sounds. And when you, as a white person with the baton, and remember, you're going to hand that baton, every different generation is going to hand that baton. You hand that baton, you take off running. You're a white person, you take off running. But in my lane, when I take off running, I have weights on me. I have all these weights on me. When I take off running, I have the weight of the black skin. And that black skin is weighing me down. But you running unhindered. But I also have 246 years of slavery that's weighting me down, but you still running freely in your lane. And then I have black codes and violence. And then I have the weight of Jim Crow, and I have the weight of segregation. But you're just running and you're handing that baton to the next generation and you're running. Man, white person, you are running your lane. But I got all these weights on me: discriminatory legislation, gerrymandering. I got all these weights, voter suppression. And then we look up to the generation we're in. You receive the baton and you're at the 80-yard line. You're at the 80-yard line, and I'm at the 20-yard line. You're at the 80, I'm at the 20-yard line. Now listen to me carefully. Listen to the analogy. Listen to the illustration. You're at the 80, I'm at the 20, and you turn around and look at me, and you tell me that the playing field is level now. You tell me that if I would just work hard, not be lazy, and not be bad, then I could be where you are. To me, to tell me that I can be where you are and the playing field is level, when we started the race, you had no weights, and I had all these weights on me, and you don't understand why I think things are unfair. When you tell me that there's no systemic racism, you tell me that the playing field is level, to me that is a lack of empathy, because it tells me that you don't realize. I want you to listen to me carefully now. It tells me that you don't realize that the gap in wealth that you have as a white person, the gap between blacks and white, and the gap between the positions that white hold in America and the authority that white hold. And we all know there's a gap between blacks and white when it comes to wealth, position, and authority. But what you don't fully understand is the only reason there is a gap is because of unfair competition. Unfair competition. And I believe this with all my heart. I believe that when the white person realized that the gap is the result of unfair competition. Because see, think about it. A person who's running in their lane with no weights against a person running in their lane and they got all these weights. Now you can get down the road and get ahead of me, but the only reason you are ahead of me is because of unfair competition. And I believe that when white people will just be honest and see that the game was rigged, it wasn't fair in the beginning, I believe that it will release empathy. And I also believe that when empathy is created in the hearts of a person, then it will lead to compassion, not sympathy. It's something about compassion that motivates people to action. Sympathy simply says, oh, I feel so sorry for you. But compassion is different. The scripture says in Matthew 14:14, it says that when Jesus saw the multitude, he was moved with compassion. And the scripture says, and he healed their sick. You see, compassion moves you to action. It moves you to act, to help, to give aid, to give support. To me, when people are willing to give support, because no one is saying that you personally should be guilty. No one is saying that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you should feel guilty. I'm not saying that you had slaves. I heard a white Christian say, I didn't own any slaves. No, nobody's accusing you of being guilty. But I am challenging you for a lack of empathy. I'll give you an illustration of what empathy looks like. I was watching television. I was watching the protests on television, and a black protester was peacefully kneeling several yards away from and facing a line of police in full protective gear. Now, I want you to get the picture. You have a line of police officers in full protective gear. They're standing. In other words, you're not going to go forward. And there was a black protester came up toward the line, but several yards away from the line, and the black protester was facing the line kneeling. A white protester went and kneeled directly in front of the black protester. A white protester, now get the picture, I want you to see the picture. The black protester is several yards away from the line. A white protester came up, kneeled right in front of the black protester, right in front of the black folk, facing the police officers. When asked, now listen, later a reporter asked the white protester, was he afraid kneeling in front of the black protester? And the white protester answered no. When the reporter asked, why weren't you afraid? The white protester said, because I am white. Now think about that. The white protester says, no, I wasn't afraid of the police because I am white. Now that's a classic illustration of empathy. The white protester demonstrated empathy, the ability to feel what someone else feels. You know that black protester probably felt some sense of fear, inhibitions, apprehension, and the white protester, because see, think about it, courage is never not feeling fear. It is doing what you need to do in spite of what you feel. But the white protester felt what he was feeling. It's the ability to understand another person's perspective. He understood that that was a big deal to kneel in front of all those police officers there in protective gear, and the ability to sense what another person needs from you. Think about it. The black protester didn't ask for it. He didn't turn around and say, hey, is there a white protester can come up here? He didn't ask for it, but the white protester understood or felt or sensed what he needed. That is empathy. And trust me, and in no way am I trying to preach to you, but for a Christian who has the nature of Jesus on the inside of them, the nature of Christ on the inside of them, to not feel any compassion, not feel any empathy toward racial equality, none whatsoever, that seems off to me. That seems that there's something lacking to not feel anything, to not feel some emotions about it. Which leads me to the third thing, roadblock that I think that hinders white people and specifically white Christians, what I call denial that there is a systemic racism problem, denial of white privilege. Denial is a refusal to believe or accept something as true. It's a refusal to believe. I believe that there are many white Christians who are in denial when it comes to race. Denial of systemic racism. Revelation chapter 3, verses 17 and verse 18 in the contemporary English version, it says, "You claim to be rich and successful and to have everything you need, but you don't know how bad off you really are. You are pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Buy medicine for your eyes so that you will be able to see." I believe that there are many white Christians who are in denial of systemic racism. In fact, I was listening to a white Christian. He was very adamant, very dogmatic, and he said there is no systemic racism. I believe the root of denial, and I want you to evaluate what I'm saying here. I believe that the root of denial is that white white people view life from a white point of reference, a white worldview, and white experience. I'll say that again. I think that it's easy to be in denial when you don't have a point of reference. It's easy to be in denial. In other words, if you have a white point of reference, white worldview, and white experience, you have to somehow project yourself, or better than that, you have to listen to someone who has a different point of reference, a different worldview, and a different experience. I believe that white people make the mistake of believing that their experience is ours. I believe that white people make the mistake of believing that their experience is black people experience. Denial of systemic racism, but I also believe that there's a denial of white privilege. Now, this word white, this designation in term white privilege disturbs white people. It disturbs them. So let's take a moment and allow me to talk to you about white privilege. But don't turn me off and don't get upset and don't get mad. Just listen. Just listen. Let's talk about white privilege. What white privilege does not mean. What white privilege does not mean. Well, white privilege does not suggest that all white people are wealthy and have never struggled in life or life was easier growing up. I'll say that again. White privilege does not suggest that all white people are wealthy. So when you hear the word white privilege, we're not saying that all white people are wealthy. We're not saying that all white people have never struggled in life. We're not saying that all white people have had it easy growing up in life. So that's not what white privilege means. Secondly, white privilege does not assume, it is not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. I want to say that and then I'll explain it. White privilege is not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. Why? Because many white people have worked hard, very hard, made many sacrifices to achieve their level of success. So white privilege is not saying that everything you have is unearned. Thirdly, having white privilege does not mean you are a racist. So you don't have to get defensive. When a person says white privilege, they're not saying you are a racist. We're not saying that you've cheated anybody to obtain what you possess. So let's push those things off. Let's push those things off. So I'll give you 3 definitions of what white privilege is, and then I want to give you some examples. Corey Collins says that white privilege is a legacy. It's a legacy. Historically, being white was a requirement to be a citizen of the United States. Historically, if you study it out, historically being white was required to be a citizen. You couldn't be a citizen unless you was white. White status and citizenship brought certain advantages. White status and citizenship brought certain advantages. On the other hand, being black brought certain disadvantages. Historically, to have advantages, all you had to have was white skin. Historically, to have disadvantages, all you had to have was black skin. So Corey Collins says that white privilege is a legacy. Now, Francis E. Kendall says that white privilege is having greater access to power and resources that people of color having greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation. And that is a really wonderful definition. So I want to say it again. Francis E. Kendall says that white privilege is having greater access to power and resources than people of color in the same situation. And then thirdly, white privilege is a built-in advantage. It's a built-in advantage. It's a built-in advantage. It's a built-in advantage separate from the level of income, separate from effort, and separate from talent. Pushing income off, pushing effort off the table, pushing talent off the table, white privilege is a built-in advantage. Now, allow me to give you some illustrations. White privilege is the ability to move through your professional and personal world without even thinking about race. Wow, that's an advantage. White privilege is the ability to move through your professional world, through your personal world, without any thought of race. See, skin color creates challenges for black people. But you don't have to have any concerns about that. In other words, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that white people have stuff to deal with. They do. They got stuff. But black people have stuff plus stuff. Did you get that? White people have stuff, have challenges, adversity, difficulties, problems. And we have the same thing, challenges, difficulties, problems. But we also have challenges just with our skin color, just with the skin color. So we have stuff plus stuff. The only time white people really think about their skin color and race is when they go into a predominantly black space, like they visit a black church, all of a sudden they sense race, they think race. So white privilege means your skin color doesn't make your life more challenging. White privilege means your skin color doesn't make your life more challenging. White privilege is having high representation in life. You see yourself with 64% of the population, you see yourself everywhere. There's a comfort level with seeing yourself everywhere. You see yourself everywhere. When you look in the magazine, you see yourself. When you look in the book, you see yourself. When you look on television, you see yourself. Oftentimes, we have to find ourselves. And usually, white people have positive portrayals in media. When you see us on media, we shot somebody, killed somebody, robbed somebody. And the sad thing about the portrayal that we get in media is that's a small percentage of black people. Black people are not robbing folk. Everybody's not robbing, stealing, killing. Oh, that's a small percentage, but that's how we are portrayed on media. White privilege is having the benefit of the doubt. It's the presumption of innocence. In other words, whites are innocent until proven guilty, and blacks are usually guilty until proven innocent. It is the presumption of innocence. That is an advantage. Whites are more likely to be believed or trusted. I'm a black person. I have a product. Lost a ticket, take it back to the store. You're a white person, you lost your ticket, you take it back to the store. Black people are going to have more challenges with a return without a receipt than a white person. That's an advantage. A white woman in New York walking her dog falsely accused a black man who was a bird watcher. The black man was videotaping her while she was talking. It went viral. On the videotape, she says that I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African American man is attacking me and my dog. Well, in reality, the black man was simply telling her that she needed to have her dog on a leash in that particular area. It was a least mandatory area. Well, she said, she didn't want to put the dog on a leash. So she said that she's going to call the police and tell the police that an African American man was attacking her. And it's on the video. She got really emotional. She literally called the police, got really emotional, and said that the black man was attacking her. Well, later on, everybody knew she was lying. She lost her job. Everybody knew she was lying. But listen at this. Whites are more likely to be believed or trusted. She knew that if it had been her word, move all the cameras out of the way, take away the videotape. She knew that her word would have more weight than an African American black man. And that has been true historically. It was just caught on tape. Whites are more likely to be treated as individuals than having some group tag on them. White people are dealt with as individuals. We are called violent, aggressive, and we steal and we lazy. So we are grouped in, but you have the advantage of being dealt with like an individual. Whites are less likely to be handled roughly by police officers. They can count on police protection. We're not sure, and I'm not saying that all police officers are protective, but historically, we are not sure how we will be handled once we're put in the police car. Whites are less likely to be handled roughly. Whites are less likely to be followed around in a store by clerks or security guards. Most of us, if you talk to the average African American adult, you can talk to teenagers, but the average adult will tell you that at some point in their life, they've walked in a store and a clerk followed them or a security guard followed them. You don't walk in stores. White people don't walk in stores and the clerk followed them and the security followed them. That's white privilege. White privilege, here's an example of white privilege. Whites are more likely to receive compassion and survive mistakes. Whites are more likely to receive compassion and survive mistakes. A black man goes to prison, leaves prison, and he's marked for the rest of his life with a record that hinders him from getting jobs. White person can go in prison with the same kind of situation, come out with a record, and it's easier for the white person to get a job than the black person with the record. But listen at this. Listen at this. A white male, this is true now, a white male with a criminal record would get just as many calls back in response to a job interview as a black male without a criminal record. I'm going to say that again because that's powerful. A white male with a criminal record. The white male has a criminal record. That white male with the criminal record would get just as many calls back in response to a job interview as a black male without a criminal record. That's white privilege. White privilege is having your history as a part of the main curriculum, not being taught as an elective. In schools, black history, if it's taught, and a lot of schools don't even teach it, if it's taught, it's an elective. White history is a part of the main curriculum. That's white privilege. White privilege is the privilege of moving into an area and your neighbors will be neutral or pleasant to you. You just move into the area, you're a white person, you move into an area, and the neighbors are going to either be pleasant to you or the neighbors going to be neutral. White people, black people can move in the same neighborhood. And it doesn't matter whether they're professional, got great jobs, educated, it doesn't matter. They will have to deal possibly with other whites who are not neutral and who are not pleasant. Now, we know that's not true in every case, but we're talking in a general way. As I close, I want to share with you a post, a social media post that I believe summarizes everything that I've talked about, from blind spots to lack of empathy to denial. Listen at this. This is a white person who posted on social media. I grew up a Chicago Cubs fan. Ernie Banks was one of my favorite players. Now, Ernie Banks, if you don't know anything about baseball, was a black baseball player. I never saw him, this is a white person said, I never saw him as a black or white guy, and I refuse to do so. This whole race argument is pathetic. A very few tragic events doesn't define anything. China has to be laughing all the way to the bank in their minds. It proves them right. Western culture is a joke. Now, it's interesting that he mentioned Ernie Banks and that he didn't see him as a black or white player. In other words, he was colorblind. He looked at him and didn't see no color, which is impossible. Then he says, this whole race argument is pathetic. A very few tragic events doesn't define anything. This whole race argument is pathetic, is a blind spot. This whole race argument is pathetic, is a lack of empathy. This whole race argument is pathetic, is denial. A very few tragic events That's a blind spot, is a lack of empathy and denial of very few tragic events. We talking about over 350 years of discrimination, over 350 years of discrimination, over 350 years of discrimination, and he says a few very tragic events doesn't define anything. So listen, I felt led to share with you as a Christian, and especially as a white Christian, are there blind spots? Are there blind spots? If somehow this teaching has helped you to see blind spots, then you have to find somebody, a person of color. You need to talk to some black people so that you can appreciate a different perspective, a different worldview. If you lack empathy, listen, the key to empathy is spending time with God, man. If you spend time with God, you're going to get his heart. There's no way that you can spend quality time in prayer and lack empathy. And then if you're in denial, you need to just, you need to, you need to, you need to, you need to listen to this lesson again and go back to all six episodes and go back through it. And I believe it's going to be a blessing. Thank you so very much for taking this time with us today. I trust that it's been a blessing to you. I trust that it's helped you. Our last episode, our seventh episode, we're going to talk about lessons from a Christian racist. And I know you're thinking, is it possible to be a Christian and be a racist? We're going to find out in the next episode.